Everyone assumed the royal property scandal started and ended with Prince Andrew. They were wrong, because buried in the same Crown estate records was another deal, one involving Prince Edward, a 51-acre estate and a rent so small it barely counts. Unlike his brother, Edward's contract let him do something Andrew never could. And once that detail came out, people started asking who really got the better deal in this family. For years, the story the public knew was simple. Prince Andrew lived in a 30-room mansion called Royal Lodge, tucked inside Windsor Great Park, and he barely paid a thing for it. The arrangement was described as peppercorn rent, a term that sounds almost comic once you understand what it actually means. It is not a discount. It is not a reduced fee. It is a token payment, sometimes literally just a token, used to keep a lease legally binding without any real money changing hands. For 2 decades, that was Andrew's arrangement with the Crown estate. And for 2 decades, almost nobody outside the family or the estate's own accountants paid it any attention. Then the walls came down. Andrew's name became attached to scandal after scandal. His royal patronages were stripped, his military titles were removed, and the pressure on the monarchy to be seen doing something became impossible to ignore. Eventually, the palace confirmed what many suspected was coming. Andrew would leave Royal Lodge. He would move to a much smaller property on the Sandringham estate, a place called Wood Farm, previously used as overflow housing for royal staff, and, at times, as a quiet retreat for other family members. The symbolism was not subtle. A man who had lived in a 30-room house with no real rent obligation was now relocating to a modest farmhouse, keeping company with the pets that had once belonged to his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II. It was, by any measure, a fall, and it made headlines everywhere because it fit the story the public had already been primed to expect. Andrew loses everything. The disgraced prince finally pays the price. The palace draws a line and holds it. That narrative was clean, satisfying, and mostly true. But something else was happening at the same time, something far quieter and far less discussed. Because Andrew was not the only member of the family living under one of these unusual Crown estate arrangements. His younger brother, Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, had one too. And when journalists and researchers started digging deeper into the royal property system in the wake of the Andrew story, they found Edward's name sitting right there in the records, attached to a 51-acre estate called Bagshot Park. Here's where the story stops being about one disgraced royal and starts being about the entire system. Bagshot Park sits in Surrey, not far from Windsor itself, a grand house with a long and layered history, originally built in the Victorian era and later rebuilt after a fire, eventually becoming one of the properties available to senior royals as a residence. Prince Edward and his wife, Sophie, moved into Bagshot Park in 1999, shortly after their wedding. It became the family home where their 2 children, Lady Louise and James, were born and raised. For more than 25 years, Bagshot Park has been synonymous with Edward's branch of the family, much the way Royal Lodge was synonymous with Andrew's. And just like Andrew, Edward's arrangement with the Crown estate involved peppercorn rent. When that detail surfaced, it should have triggered the same kind of scrutiny that swallowed Andrew whole. Here was another senior royal, holding a lease on a sprawling estate, paying next to nothing in rent, at a time when public sentiment toward royal finances was already at a boiling point. But the reaction was different, quieter, almost muted by comparison, partly because Edward has spent decades cultivating a reputation as the low-key royal, the one without scandal attached to his name, the one who shows up, does the work, and stays out of the tabloids. But partly, too, because the details of his lease, once they were actually examined, turned out to be even more favorable than Andrew's ever were. That is the part almost nobody expected. According to reporting that emerged from the Times and was picked up by outlets internationally, Edward's original lease on Bagshot Park was signed back in March of 1998 at a rent of £5,000 a year. To put that in perspective, £5,000 a year for a 51-acre estate with a grand historic house on it is not a market rate. It is a fraction of what any private tenant would ever be asked to pay for, a fraction of the space. But the story does not end there, because Edward did put money into the property. He personally contributed £1.36 million toward renovating Bagshot Park as part of a broader refurbishment that cost roughly £3 million in total, with the Crown estate covering the remainder. After that investment, and after the lease was extended in 2007 through a company associated with Edward called Eclipse Nominees Limited, the rent was adjusted upward, eventually reaching £90,000 a year. And this is where the story gets interesting in a very specific, very telling way. Because when the National Audit Office reviewed that £90,000 figure, it was officially described as market value, not a discount, not a special royal accommodation. Market value, according to the government's own auditors. Now sit with that for a moment, because this is the detail that changes the entire shape of the comparison. Andrew's peppercorn rent at Royal Lodge became a national scandal, a symbol of royal entitlement, proof that the family was living outside the normal rules that govern everyone else. Edward's arrangement, once renegotiated, was independently assessed by government auditors as being in line with what the market would actually charge. Two brothers, two similar sounding deals, two completely different outcomes when someone finally checked the paperwork. But rent numbers are only half of this story. The other half, the part that really got people talking once it surfaced, has to do with what happens to these leases in the future. Because it turns out that not all peppercorn arrangements are created equal, and the fine print buried inside each contract reveals something about how the Crown Estate quietly treats different family members in different ways. Andrew's agreement at Royal Lodge contained a specific restriction. According to reporting on the lease terms, if Andrew ever wanted to pass on the property, the agreement stated it could only go to his widow, meaning his former wife, Sarah, Ferguson in a hypothetical future scenario, or to his daughters, Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie. It could not be sold, transferred, or handed off to anyone outside that narrow family circle. Whatever value existed in that lease was locked in place, tied to bloodline and marriage, incapable of being converted into cash or handed to an outside party. Edward's contract at Bagshot Park does not carry that same restriction. According to the reporting, Edward's agreement allows him to sell on the lease at some point in the future, and to keep whatever profit comes from that sale. That is a fundamentally different kind of asset. One lease is a private, tightly bound family privilege that ends where the bloodline ends. The other is something closer to a transferable financial interest, a piece of property that can eventually be converted into real money, sold to whoever is willing to buy it, with Edward personally benefiting from whatever price it fetches. Brian Johnston, a property litigation partner at the law firm Denton's, was asked to help explain why these terms vary so dramatically between different royals holding what looks, on the surface, like the same kind of deal. His explanation, in essence, was that these leases are not standardized. Each one is negotiated individually, shaped by the specific circumstances of the person taking it on. Andrew, for instance, was required to fund major renovation work at Royal Lodge as part of his arrangement, and that investment was treated as part of the value he brought to the table in exchange for the lease terms he received. That explanation makes a kind of logical sense on paper. Different royals put different amounts of money in, so they get different terms out. But it also raises an obvious question that a lot of people watching this story unfold have been asking. If both brothers put significant personal money into renovating their respective properties, why did one end up with a lease that can be sold for profit, while the other ended up with a lease that dies with him unless it passes to his widow or daughters? Why did one brother's arrangement get independently verified by the National Audit Office as market value rent, while the other brother's arrangement became the exact kind of peppercorn deal that triggered a national scandal? There's no simple answer sitting in the public record, and that absence of a clean explanation is exactly what has kept this story alive. Because it is not really about Edward specifically, or even about Andrew specifically. It is about what these two contrasting deals reveal, about how the institution of the monarchy actually functions behind its polished public image. For decades, the royal family has presented itself as a unified institution, operating under shared rules, shared expectations, and shared standards of conduct and privilege. But when you start pulling actual paperwork out of the Crown Estate's records, you find something much closer to a patchwork of individually negotiated private arrangements, each shaped by different circumstances, different leverage, and quite possibly different levels of scrutiny at the time each deal was struck. And Bagshot Park is not the only property caught up in this wider reckoning. Once Andrew's rent situation became public, it triggered a chain reaction across the rest of the family's housing arrangements, with journalists and members of the public suddenly asking uncomfortable questions about who else might be living under similarly generous terms. Prince William and Princess Kate found themselves having to publicly confirm that they pay what has been described as market rent for their own Windsor property, Forest Lodge, a clarification that almost certainly would not have been necessary if the Andrew story had never broken. Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie, who each hold grace and favor residences on royal grounds, faced their own wave of public calls to give up those arrangements entirely, with critics arguing that in an era of tightening public finances, this kind of inherited privilege is increasingly difficult to justify. In other words, the scrutiny did not stay contained to Andrew. It spread outward, sweeping through the entire structure of who lives where, who pays what, and who negotiated which terms with the Crown Estate over the past several decades. And in that wider sweep, Edward's Bagshot Park arrangement turned out to be one of the more revealing case studies, precisely because it was not a scandal in the traditional sense. Nobody has accused Edward of wrongdoing. Nobody has suggested his lease was improperly obtained. By most accounts, the £90,000 rent he eventually settled on has been independently confirmed as fair market value. And yet, sitting right alongside that fair market rent is a transfer clause that quietly gives Edward something his own brother never had, the ability to eventually sell his interest in a crown property and personally pocket the proceeds. That is the detail that keeps drawing people back into this story. It is not a scandal built on outrage. It is a scandal built on quiet contrast, on the slow realization that even inside a family bound together by tradition, title, and public duty, the actual paperwork tells a story of unequal treatment, negotiated in private, revealed only when public pressure forced these documents into the light. Think about what this means for how we understand the monarchy going forward. For generations, the public was largely kept at arm's length from these kinds of details. Royal housing arrangements were treated as a private matter, tucked away inside Crown estate paperwork that rarely saw daylight, protected by a combination of institutional secrecy and simple public disinterest. Most people simply assumed that royals lived in royal properties because that is what royals do, without ever asking who actually held the lease, what the rent was, or what would happen to that lease decades down the line. Andrew's fall from grace changed that. It forced open a door that had been closed for a very long time, and once that door opened, it did not close again. People started asking about Forest Lodge. People started asking about Beatrice and Eugenie's homes, and now people are asking about Bagshot Park and about Edward. The brother who was supposed to be the safe one, the boring one, the one whose life was never interesting enough to make headlines. Except now it is making headlines, not because Edward did anything wrong, but because his lease terms happen to be more favorable than his disgraced brother's. And that contrast alone is enough to reignite a conversation about fairness inside a family that has spent centuries insisting it operates by consistent rules. There's also a deeper irony sitting underneath all of this, one that becomes clearer the longer you sit with the details. Andrew was the brother who became a public liability, the one whose personal conduct dragged the institution through scandal after scandal, forcing King Charles to make a very public example out of him by stripping his patronages, his titles, and eventually his home. That decision was framed both by the palace and by much of the press as a demonstration that the monarchy could hold even its most senior members accountable, that nobody, not even the son of the late queen, was above consequence. But consequence, it turns out, is not the same thing as equal treatment. Because while Andrew lost his home and moved into a modest farmhouse, his brother Edward has spent the better part of 3 decades sitting on a 51-acre estate with a lease that, according to the reporting that has now surfaced, allows him to walk away one day with a sale and a profit that Andrew's own agreement never permitted. Andrew's punishment was public and dramatic. Edward's advantage has been quiet and largely unexamined, at least until now. None of this necessarily means that Edward has done anything improper. His rent, once renegotiated, was assessed as fair market value by independent auditors. His personal financial contribution to the property's renovation was substantial, more than £1 million out of his own pocket. By the standards that typically govern these kinds of arrangements, his lease appears to have been negotiated honestly and transparently, at least as transparently as these things ever are inside an institution built on centuries of private tradition. But fairness is not only about whether a deal was negotiated honestly, it is also about whether similar people, in similar positions, end up with similar outcomes. And on that measure, the comparison between Edward and Andrew raises questions that are much harder to answer cleanly. Why does one brother's lease allow for a future sale and personal profit, while the other's is locked to blood relatives only? Why does one brother's rent get certified as market value by government auditors, while the other's became the peppercorn arrangement that helped trigger a national reckoning over royal finances? Why did it take a full-blown scandal involving one brother to bring public attention to the quieter, seemingly cleaner arrangement held by the other? These are not questions with obvious villains attached. Nobody involved has broken the law. Nobody has been accused of fraud or deception. And yet the story persists, because it touches something the public has been increasingly sensitive to for years now, the sense that the modern monarchy, for all its talk of modernization, of slimming down, of operating more like any other institution accountable to public scrutiny, still runs on a set of private arrangements that were never designed to be seen, and that reveal, once they finally are seen, just how unevenly even close family members can be treated. It is worth remembering, too, that these property arrangements are not just about housing. They are about wealth, and about how wealth quietly accumulates and transfers inside a family that occupies a strange position at the intersection of public duty and private inheritance. A lease that can eventually be sold for profit is not simply a place to live. It is a financial asset, one that can be converted into liquid wealth at some point down the line, passed along in a way that benefits Edward personally, his wife. Sophie, and potentially his children, Louise and James, well beyond whatever their formal royal roles might eventually look like. Andrew's lease, by contrast, offered no such financial upside. It could be passed to Sarah Ferguson or to his daughters, but it could never be turned into cash and handed off to whoever might want it. That is not a small distinction. That is the difference between an inherited privilege and a genuine financial asset, and it is exactly the kind of distinction the public rarely gets to see clearly until a scandal forces the paperwork into daylight. So where does this leave the family, and where does it leave the broader question of how the Crown Estate manages the properties it hands out to senior royals? For now, there is no indication that Edward's lease is under any kind of formal review, and there is no suggestion that his arrangement will be renegotiated the way Andrew's ultimately was. Bagshot Park remains his family home, the place where Louise and James grew up, the estate that has quietly anchored his branch of the family for more than 2 decades. Unless public pressure builds around this specific comparison the way it built around Andrew's situation, it is entirely possible that this story fades back into the background, another detail buried inside Crown Estate paperwork that most people will simply move on from. But the comparison itself is unlikely to disappear entirely, because it fits into a much larger pattern that has been building around the monarchy for years now, a slow, steady erosion of the assumption that royal life operates by rules the public simply is not meant to question. Every time one of these leases comes to light, every time a rent figure or a transfer clause gets reported, it chips away a little more at the idea that the family's internal arrangements are simply none of the public's business. And once that assumption starts to crack, it becomes very difficult to put back together, because the next question is always the same. If we know about Andrew's lease and we know about Edward's lease, what about everyone else? What about the arrangements nobody has looked into yet? The properties nobody has thought to ask about? The contracts sitting quietly in Crown Estate files, waiting for the next scandal to drag them into public view? That is really what this story is about. Underneath all the specific numbers and dates and lease clauses, it is about the slow unraveling of privacy around an institution that has always relied on privacy to maintain its particular kind of authority and mystique. Andrew's downfall opened the door. Edward's Bagshot Park lease is what walked through it. Next, not because Edward did anything scandalous, but simply because the door was already open, and once people started looking, they did not stop at the one brother everyone already suspected. They kept looking, and they found another deal, quieter, cleaner on the surface, but carrying its own uncomfortable questions about who gets what inside a family that likes to present itself as fair, unified, and accountable to the same standards it expects everyone else to follow. Whether this leads to any actual change in how the Crown Estate manages these properties remains to be seen. Institutions like the monarchy tend to move slowly, absorbing pressure without necessarily changing course, weathering one round of scrutiny before quietly returning to business as usual once public attention shifts elsewhere. But for now, the contrast between these two brothers, one who lost his home in disgrace and one who has quietly held onto a 51-acre estate with terms that may one day let him walk away with a personal profit, stands as one of the clearest illustrations yet of how much remains hidden inside the private world of royal property, and how much can change in the public's understanding the moment even a small piece of that paperwork finally comes to light. To really understand why this comparison lands so hard with the public, it helps to step back and look at the bigger financial picture the monarchy operates inside of. The Crown Estate is not a private company owned outright by the royal family. It is a vast portfolio of land and property technically belonging to the reigning monarch in right of the crown, managed independently, with a significant share of its annual profits handed over to the Treasury and then returned to the royal family as public funding through what is known as the sovereign grant. In simple terms, the properties these leases are attached to are not simply personal possessions the family can do whatever they like with. They sit inside a structure that is meant to answer, at least indirectly, to the taxpayer, because the value generated by the wider Crown Estate portfolio helps determine how much public money flows back to fund royal duties each year. That is exactly why leases like Andrew's and Edward's matter once they become public knowledge. These are not simply questions of which brother has a nicer garden or a bigger house. They are questions about how public assets, held in trust for the nation, are distributed among family members, on what terms, and under what justification. When Andrew's peppercorn rent became public, it raised uncomfortable questions about whether crown assets were being handed out on the basis of family relationships rather than genuine market principles, at a moment when ordinary citizens were dealing with rising costs of living and growing skepticism about the value the monarchy provides in exchange for public funding. Edward's situation complicates that narrative because, unlike Andrew, his rent was eventually assessed as market value. On paper, that should make his arrangement far less controversial, and in terms of the raw rent figure, it largely has been, without the same backlash that hit Andrew. But the transfer clause changes the calculation. Market value rent addresses one half of the fairness question, whether the family member pays what anyone else would to occupy that land, while the transfer clause addresses an entirely different half, whether that family member is also quietly building long-term personal wealth out of a property that ultimately belongs to the crown, and, by extension, to the public it is meant to serve. This is where the story stops being simply about Edward and Andrew, and becomes a bigger conversation about intergenerational wealth inside the monarchy. If Edward's lease really can be sold at some point for personal profit, that profit does not come from nowhere. It comes from land and buildings that form part of a public trust, appreciating over decades, ultimately convertible into private wealth through a transaction few outside the family will ever fully understand. Multiply that arrangement across other royal properties, other quietly negotiated leases sitting in Crown Estate files nobody has examined yet, and you start to see why this single detail about Bagshot Park has generated so much attention. It is not really about one estate in Surrey. It is about what that estate represents, a small visible thread in a much larger, less visible fabric of royal wealth management that has operated largely outside public view for generations. There's also the question of timing and why this contrast between Edward and Andrew is surfacing now rather than years ago when both leases were already active. Part of the answer is that royal finances have become a far more actively scrutinized subject in recent years than in previous decades. The costs of running the monarchy, the size of the sovereign grant, the value of Crown Estate profits, all of these figures now attract regular media coverage in a way that would have seemed unusual a generation ago. Add to that the catalyst of Andrew's very public fall, which forced journalists to start pulling at threads they might otherwise have left alone, and you get exactly the conditions that led to Bagshot Park's lease terms finally being laid out in public reporting. It is also worth considering how this reflects on the different public personas the two brothers have cultivated. Andrew, for a long stretch of his life, was seen as a hard-working if awkward member of the family, until his conduct turned him into one of the most damaging figures the modern monarchy has had to distance itself from. Edward, by contrast, built a reputation as steady and largely uncontroversial, quietly carrying out engagements and avoiding the tabloid attention that followed his siblings for decades. That contrast in public image is precisely why the lease comparison lands with such force. It is easy to accept that a disgraced prince lost his generous housing arrangement. It is harder to shrug off the discovery that the boring, well-behaved brother has quietly held an even better deal the entire time, one that could eventually convert into a financial windfall. His disgraced brother was never permitted to receive. None of this guarantees that Bagshot Park will become the next major flashpoint in the conversation about royal finances. Institutions built on centuries of tradition have a long history of absorbing scrutiny, weathering a news cycle, and quietly continuing largely unchanged. But every one of these revelations adds another data point to a longer pattern, one where the gap between the monarchy's public image of unity and restraint and the private reality of individually negotiated financial arrangements keeps getting harder to ignore. Whether or not Bagshot Park itself becomes a lasting symbol of that gap, the underlying dynamic it represents is not going away anytime soon, and the next lease, the next estate, the next quietly buried Crown Estate contract is very likely already sitting somewhere in the files, waiting for the next scandal to bring it into the light, the same way Andrew's downfall brought Edward's arrangement into view. For now, Bagshot Park remains exactly what it has been for the past 25 years, the quiet home of the family's quiet brother. But quiet, as this story has shown, does not always mean simple, and the paperwork behind even the most unremarkable royal residence can carry details that reshape how an entire family and an entire institution is understood by the public it ultimately answers to.